A man is on his knees, weeping, in front of a locked scroll that no one in heaven, on earth, or under the earth can open. He has been searching the entire room, every angel, every elder, every living creature crowded around the throne, and not one of them qualifies to break the seal. Then a voice tells him to stop crying, because someone has finally been found who can. The one who can break the seal is announced with a title so violent it makes you brace yourself before you even see him. The Lion of the tribe of Judah has triumphed. You expect a beast. You expect claws, a mane soaked in the blood of whatever it just tore apart. A roar loud enough to shatter the throne room and send every lesser creature in the vision scattering. And when John finally turns to look at the thing everyone has been waiting for, what he sees instead is a lamb, standing upright but visibly bearing the wounds of something that had already been slaughtered. The most ferocious title given to the Messiah anywhere in the entire Bible belongs, on paper, to a man whose own family tree should have disqualified him from anything sacred at all. Because the Messiah did not come from the best of Jacob's 12 sons. He came from one of the worst, a man who sold his own brother into slavery for the price of a pair of sandals and a handful of silver. A man who impregnated his daughter-in-law without knowing who she was, and who was ready to have her burned alive for the same sin he had just committed himself. That man's name becomes the name of an entire nation. His name becomes the name of the Messiah's tribe. His symbol becomes a lion. And by the end of this story, you will understand why heaven waited 4,000 years to explain the joke. It starts, strangely, with a woman nobody wanted. Jacob had fled to Paddan Aram to escape his brother Esau's fury, and there he fell for a girl named Rachel. Beautiful, the kind of beauty ancient texts don't usually bother describing in detail, which is its own kind of compliment. He worked 7 years for her hand, and on the wedding night, in the dark, under a veil, in a culture where a bride was delivered to the groom's tent without much room for a face-to-face conversation beforehand, Laban swapped his daughters. Jacob woke up married to Leah, Rachel's older sister, the one the text describes with a phrase that has been translated a dozen different ways over the centuries: weak-eyed, or tender-eyed, or plain. But every translation agrees on the same underlying fact. She was not the one he wanted. He worked another 7 years for Rachel. Now imagine being Leah. You are married to a man who is legally obligated to you and completely uninterested in you, sharing a household with a sister he adores, in a system where a wife's value was tied directly to her ability to produce sons for her husband's name. So Leah has a son and calls him Reuben, which sounds like the Hebrew for "he has seen my affliction," because she says, "Now my husband will love me." Second son, Simeon, one who hears, because the Lord heard that she was unloved. Third son, Levi, attached, because now surely her husband will become attached to her. 3 sons in, and still bargaining for affection. Picture the household itself for a second, because it explains everything that follows. 2 sisters, married to the same man, living inside the same tent complex, competing not for romance in the modern sense, but for status, for security, for the only currency a woman in that world had any real control over: sons. Rachel is barren for years and burns with envy every time Leah gives birth again. Leah knows exactly why she was given to Jacob in the first place. Not chosen, substituted, and she knows exactly how her husband's eyes move when Rachel walks into a room. Every child Leah bears in these early years is, in a very real sense, a bid, an attempt to purchase with fertility what she could never win with a glance. That's the emotional engine behind Reuben, Simeon, and Levi's names, 3 separate rounds of the same losing game. Then comes the 4th son, and something changes in the language itself. Leah does not mention her husband at all this time. No plea, no bargaining, no accounting of what this child might finally earn her in Jacob's eyes. She names him Judah, and the text tells us exactly why. This time, I will praise the Lord. The Hebrew root is yada, to praise, to give thanks, the same root you'll find later at the center of the word, hallelujah. 3 children spent trying to win a man's love. The 4th child, she stops performing for a husband and turns instead toward God. It is such a small narrative hinge, a single line in a genealogy chapter people tend to skip, and yet the entire story you're about to hear is going to keep circling back to that one word: praise. Judah's name is a form of surrender disguised as a birth announcement, a woman finally giving up on being chosen by a man and choosing instead to be grateful to God for what she already had. Keep that thread in your hand. It resurfaces at the very end of this story, in a place you would never expect. Fast forward decades. Jacob is old now, living out his final years in Egypt after his family relocated there during a famine. Reunited unexpectedly with the son he believed dead for 2 decades, and he calls his 12 sons to his bedside for what the text explicitly frames as prophecy, not sentimental deathbed advice about being good to one another, but a series of formal pronouncements about what each tribe descending from each son will actually become. "Gather yourselves together," he tells them, "that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days." This is a dying patriarch handing out the future itself, tribe by tribe, and this is where the ranking gets brutal. Reuben, the firstborn, the one who should inherit the double portion and the leadership of the family by every convention of the ancient Near East, gets disqualified in a single sentence. "Unstable as water, you will not excel, because you went up onto your father's bed, defiling it." That's a reference to an incident recorded earlier. Reuben sleeping with Bilhah, his father's concubine, a direct assault on Jacob's household honor. Firstborn, gone. Next in line by birth order, Simeon and Levi, and Jacob doesn't soften this one either. "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." This is fallout from Shechem, the massacre the 2 brothers carried out after their sister Dinah was assaulted by a local prince. They didn't just kill the offender, they slaughtered every male in the city under false pretenses of a peace treaty. 2 brothers down. And now we arrive at son number 4, the one whose mother once said, "This time I will praise." "Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you." And then the line that gives this entire nation its emblem. "Judah is a lion's cub, gur aria in the Hebrew. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him?" The description isn't a young lion in the sense of weak or untested. It's the specific image of a cub that has already returned from a successful hunt, already fed, now resting in total confidence, because nothing left in the field can threaten it. Then Jacob adds the line that becomes one of the most argued over prophecies in the entire Hebrew Bible. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." A scepter is a ruler's staff, a symbol of kingship, and a lawgiver, in this context, refers to the one holding judicial and legislative authority over the people. Jacob is saying, out loud, roughly 400 years before there is even a monarchy in Israel, that kingship and the authority to govern belong to this one tribe, and that it will not fully depart from that tribe until someone or something called Shiloh arrives. The word itself has generated centuries of debate precisely because its meaning isn't obvious even in the original Hebrew. Ancient Jewish interpreters read it multiple ways. Some understood it as a place name, tying it to the town of Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood for generations before the temple was built in Jerusalem. Others parsed it as a compound, meaning roughly, the one to whom it belongs, reading the line as a promise that kingship would ultimately be handed over, in full, to a specific figure who had the rightful claim to it. The Targums, ancient Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible produced by Jewish scholars in the centuries around and after the time of Jesus, consistently render this line in an explicitly messianic direction, translating it as a reference to a king or anointed ruler who would come from Judah and receive the obedience of the nations, showing that this messianic reading of the verse existed within Judaism itself, long before it became a cornerstone of Christian argument. The community at Qumran, the group behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, likewise preserved and cited this passage as pointing toward an expected royal Davidic figure. Early Christian writers simply inherited an interpretive tradition that was already circulating and applied the same reading to Jesus. Whichever translation you land on, the underlying claim is the same. Kingship stays fixed to this one tribe until a specific figure shows up to receive it permanently. Why a lion, though, and not an eagle or a bull, or any other animal that shows up elsewhere in Scripture as a symbol of strength? This is where it helps to step outside the text for a moment and look at what lion actually meant to the people living in that world. In Mesopotamia, Assyrian kings covered the walls of their palaces with reliefs of themselves hunting lions, sometimes literally staged hunts where captured lions were released from cages, specifically so the king could be shown killing them in front of an audience. Propaganda carved in stone. The king as the only man alive capable of subduing the deadliest animal in the region. The reliefs from Ashurbanipal's palace at Nineveh, carved centuries after Jacob, but drawing on a symbolic vocabulary that had already been in use for a very long time, show the king shooting arrows into charging lions from a chariot while attendants hold back the animals with spears. A scene repeated panel after panel along the palace corridor, so that anyone walking to meet the king physically passed through a visual argument for his supremacy before ever laying eyes on him. Lion hunting wasn't sport in this world. It was a ritual proof of kingship, and Assyrian and later Babylonian kings guarded their exclusive right to it fiercely, since a commoner killing a lion would have muddied a symbol the throne depended on. In Egypt, the Sphinx fuses a lion's body with a human or divine head, guarding tombs and temples precisely because the lion was understood as the ultimate image of sovereign, watchful power, a creature strong enough to defend what it guarded and intelligent enough to know what it was guarding. The pairing wasn't decorative, it was theological shorthand. Divine kingship needed a body that could actually enforce it. Further north, at Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a city whose archives have given historians an enormous amount of insight into the religious imagination shared across this entire region, lion imagery clusters around storm gods and kings, almost interchangeably, the animal functioning as a kind of visual password for legitimate rule wherever it appears. Babylon's Ishtar Gate, built centuries after Jacob, but drawing on symbolism that long predates it, is lined with glazed brick lions marching in procession toward the throne room, each one glazed in blue and gold, repeated dozens of times down the ceremonial road, so that the approach itself became a kind of liturgy of power. And in Israel's own later history, when Solomon builds his throne, the text in the Book of Kings describes it flanked by 12 lions, one standing on each side of the 6 steps leading up to the seat, an unmistakable declaration that this throne, and by extension the tribe it belongs to, carries the authority the ancient world universally associated with that one animal. Solomon didn't invent this symbolism. He borrowed a visual language every surrounding empire already spoke fluently and applied it, deliberately, to a throne that belonged to Judah. So when Jacob calls Judah a lion's cub, he isn't reaching for a generic compliment about bravery. He is placing an entire royal vocabulary, one shared by every major empire surrounding Israel, onto the shoulders of the 4th son of an unloved wife. The prophecy doesn't stay locked inside Jacob's family. Centuries later, Israel has left Egypt, survived the wilderness, and is now camped on the plains of Moab, an enormous, visible, terrifying presence to the kingdoms in the region, And the Moabite king Balak looks at this mass of people camped on his border and panics. He sends messengers, with the going rate for divination in hand, to a prophet named Balaam, a diviner known and respected well outside Israel's own borders, someone whose blessings and curses were understood, even by pagan kings, to actually carry weight. Balak's request is simple and brutal. Come curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. Balaam actually sets out toward the job, and the episode famously includes his donkey stopping in the road, refusing to move, beaten 3 times by a frustrated Balaam who cannot see what the animal can, an angel with a drawn sword blocking the path, until the donkey itself speaks and asks why it's being struck. It's a strange, almost comic interruption in an otherwise tense political standoff, but its function in the story is to make one point unmistakably clear before Balaam ever opens his mouth over Israel. Whatever this prophet says next is not going to be his own idea. And every single time he opens his mouth to curse Israel, blessing comes out instead. 4 separate oracles, each one stronger and more specific than the last, delivered from 3 different vantage points, as Balak drags him from hilltop to hilltop, hoping a different view of the Israelite camp might produce a different result. Inside the 3rd oracle, with Balak by now furious and demanding Balaam neither bless nor curse them at all, just stop talking. The exact same image from Jacob's deathbed resurfaces almost word for word. He crouches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lioness who dares rouse him. Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you. This is a foreign prophet, hired by a hostile king specifically to weaken this nation with a curse, standing on foreign soil under financial and political pressure to deliver exactly the opposite message. And the mouth that was supposed to curse them ends up repeating Jacob's private family blessing back at them in public, loudly enough that the king paying for the curse hears every word of his money being wasted. If you're building a case that a promise is real, and not just wishful family folklore passed down at dinner tables, having your enemy's own paid prophet independently confirm the identical image centuries later, under direct financial incentive to say the opposite, is about as strong a confirmation as ancient Near Eastern storytelling ever offers. And it's worth noting that this wasn't just poetic language floating disconnected from actual daily life. When the Book of Numbers lays out exactly how the 12 tribes were organized around the tabernacle in the wilderness, and in what order they marched whenever the camp broke and moved, Judah's tribe is placed at the very front, its standard leading the entire nation whenever they set out, with the explicit instruction that Judah's camp goes first. A prophecy about future kingship is one thing, priests reciting a blessing centuries removed from any practical consequence, but a marching order followed by literally every other tribe, generation after generation in the wilderness, is a very different, far more concrete kind of deference. The other 11 tribes physically falling in line behind the one Jacob had singled out on his deathbed. But here's where the story stops being flattering, because the man this prophecy is actually about is nowhere near lion-like in his own lifetime. And understanding just how far from noble he starts out makes everything that follows land that much harder. Genesis 37 gives us the backstory. Jacob openly favors Joseph, the firstborn son of his beloved Rachel, gifting him an elaborate, richly ornamented coat that the other 10 older brothers do not receive, a visible daily reminder of exactly where they rank in their father's affection. Joseph doesn't help his own case either, reporting dreams to his brothers in which their sheaves of grain bow down to his, and the sun, moon, and 11 stars bow down to him, dreams that, whether or not he means them as boasting, land as exactly that. Resentment builds until the brothers get Joseph alone out in the countryside near Dothan, far from their father's sight, and the older brothers, according to the text, plot to kill him outright and dump his body in a pit, then tell their father a wild animal devoured him. It's at this exact point that Judah speaks up, and standing over a pit with his brothers, having just watched them throw their teenage sibling into it, He proposes something that sounds almost merciful by comparison to outright murder, and is, in reality, purely transactional. What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our flesh. Not a word of protection for Joseph as a person, not an appeal to spare their father's grief. Just an economic argument dressed up as restraint. Why waste a sellable asset on a killing nobody will profit from? His brothers agree. 20 pieces of silver later, Joseph is in chains headed toward Egypt in a caravan of spice traders, and Judah walks away having converted what was already a murder in intent into a small profit margin in execution. This is the man whose descendants will one day be called the lion's cub. Then Genesis 38 happens, and if you've never read it carefully, it might be the strangest chapter in the entire book, dropped almost jarringly in the middle of Joseph's story, as if the narrator wanted this particular family's dysfunction on record before the plot moves on. Judah, having drifted away from his father's household and settled among Canaanites, marries off his firstborn son to a local woman named Tamar. Dies, described only as wicked in the Lord's sight. No further detail given, no explanation offered, just a sudden death and a young widow. Per the custom of levirate marriage, meant to preserve a dead man's name and inheritance by having a brother father a child on the widow's behalf, Judah's second son, Onan, is obligated to give Tamar a child in his dead brother's name, and instead deliberately avoids fulfilling the obligation each time, unwilling to produce an heir who would legally count as his brother's rather than his own, and he dies too. At this point, Judah has lost 2 sons in rapid succession, both connected to this one woman, and rather than examine what might actually be happening inside his own household among his own sons, he tells Tamar to go back and live as a widow in her father's house until his 3rd son, Shelah, is old enough to marry her, quietly intending never to actually follow through, because he has privately concluded wrongly that Tamar herself must be cursed or somehow lethal to husbands, easier to blame the daughter-in-law than the sons. Years pass. Shelah grows into a man. Judah never sends for her. Tamar, meanwhile, is stuck in a kind of legal limbo, technically still bound to Judah's family and therefore unable to marry anyone else, growing older in her father's house with no resolution in sight. So she takes matters into her own hands in a way that is bold even by the standards of a book already full of bold women. She hears that Judah, now widowed himself after the death of his own wife, is traveling up to Timnah for the sheep shearing, a seasonal event that in that culture came with a festive, loosened atmosphere. She removes her widow's garments, the clothing that marked her status and, not coincidentally, her unavailability, veils her face, and sits at the entrance to Enaim, a town along the road Judah is known to be traveling. Judah, recently widowed and evidently not looking too closely, doesn't recognize his own daughter-in-law behind the veil and assumes she's a prostitute working the roadside. He negotiates payment, a young goat to be sent later from his flock, and, since he has nothing on him to pay immediately, leaves his personal seal, its cord and his staff as a pledge until the goat can be delivered. Items that in that world functioned essentially as a man's signature and identification, the ancient equivalent of leaving your wallet and passport as collateral. 3 months later, word reaches Judah that his daughter-in-law Tamar is pregnant, and given that she is technically still bound to his household, waiting on Shelah, this reads to him as adultery, a betrayal of the family, punishable in his own judgment by burning. He orders her brought out to be executed. No trial, no hesitation. The head of the household exercising exactly the kind of authority the culture granted him. And Tamar, instead of pleading for her life, sends a message ahead, along with the seal, the cord, and the staff. The man who owns these is the father of my child. Please identify, she says, whose these are. Judah is forced, in front of his entire household, to recognize his own personal items, the very things that would have named him publicly as a client of the woman he was about to have executed. And the verdict he delivers about himself, out loud, in front of witnesses, is the single most self-aware line the man ever speaks in the entire Bible. She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. The man who once proposed selling his own brother for silver is now publicly humiliated by the very woman he had ordered burned alive, forced to admit in front of his household that she acted with more integrity in securing her rightful place in the family than he did in protecting her. This is not a footnote the storytellers of ancient Israel would have wanted to include if they were simply trying to flatter the tribe of Judah. And that's part of what makes it so striking, centuries later, when Matthew, writing a genealogy meant to establish Jesus' royal credentials as a descendant of David and of Judah, deliberately includes Tamar by name, one of only 4 women mentioned in that entire genealogy alongside Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Rahab ran a house of prostitution built into the city wall of Jericho, a Canaanite woman from a people group Israel had been commanded to destroy entirely upon entering the land. And yet she hides Israelite spies at personal risk, negotiates for her family's survival, and ends up not just spared, but folded directly into the ancestral line of the coming king. Ruth is a Moabite, from a nation with such a hostile history against Israel that the law explicitly barred Moabites from entering the assembly of the Lord for 10 generations. And yet her story, a foreign widow choosing loyalty to her Israelite mother-in-law over returning to her own people and gods, ends with her marrying Boaz and becoming, by the text's own reckoning, David's great-grandmother. And Bathsheba is referenced not even by her own name, but as the wife of Uriah, a quiet, devastating reminder of exactly how David acquired her, through an affair that led directly to Uriah's engineered death on the battlefield, a crime the prophet Nathan confronted David over face to face. Ancient genealogies, especially royal ones, simply did not include women unless there was a specific reason to, and every single reason here is scandal, foreign blood, or both. Matthew is not hiding the mess in this family line. He's pointing straight at it, page 1, before a single miracle has even been narrated. And there's a redemption arc buried inside Judah's own story that most tellings skip past too quickly. Years after selling Joseph, Judah doesn't know it, but he ends up standing in front of that very brother again, now the second most powerful man in Egypt, dressed as an Egyptian official, speaking through an interpreter, completely unrecognizable, during the famine that drives Jacob's family south, looking for grain to survive. Joseph, testing his brothers to see whether they've actually changed since the day they threw him in a pit, has a silver cup planted in the youngest brother Benjamin's sack, then frames him for its theft and declares that Benjamin alone will remain in Egypt as a slave while the rest are free to go home. It is, structurally, almost the same scenario his brothers created decades earlier. A favored younger brother, at risk, and the older brothers free to simply walk away and let it happen. And it is Judah, the same man who once stood over a pit and proposed selling Joseph for a profit, rather than getting blood on anyone's hands, who steps forward this time and delivers one of the longest, most emotionally exposed speeches in the entire book of Genesis. Recounting the whole history to this Egyptian official he doesn't realize is his own brother, describing their father's grief over losing Joseph and his terror of losing Benjamin too, and then offering himself directly in Benjamin's place. "Please, let your servant remain instead of the young man as a slave to my lord, and let the young man go up with his brothers. He cannot bear," he says, "to go back and watch his father die from the grief it would cause." This is the same brother, in the same country, facing an almost identical decision 2 decades later. And this time, instead of calculating a profit, he offers his own freedom in exchange for someone else's. It is, as far as the text shows us, the first time in the entire book of Genesis that anyone volunteers to take another person's punishment fully onto themselves. And it's this speech, more than anything else Judah ever does, that finally breaks Joseph and causes him to reveal who he really is. Notice the shape that keeps repeating by this point in the story. A rejected wife instead of a chosen one. A fourth son instead of a firstborn. A lion's blessing pronounced over a man who behaved nothing like one. A brother who sold family for silver, later offering himself up in that same family's place. Every single time this narrative reaches a fork in the road between the obvious choice and the overlooked one, it takes the overlooked one. And it does this so consistently across so many centuries that it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a pattern. The story is actively building towards something. That pattern is about to repeat one more time, on the largest scale yet, in a small town called Bethlehem. Centuries later, the throne actually does land on Judah's tribe, but not through the oldest or most obvious candidate. Israel's first king, Saul, comes from Benjamin, chosen partly because the text tells us he stood a head taller than everyone else. Exactly the kind of visible, commanding presence a young nation wanted in a king. And he is a disaster by the end of his reign, disobedient, paranoid, and eventually rejected by God as unfit to found a lasting dynasty. So the prophet Samuel is sent, secretly, at real personal risk, given that Saul is still very much alive and armed, to the little town of Bethlehem, to anoint a replacement from the household of a man named Jesse, a descendant of Judah through Boaz and Ruth. Jesse parades 7 sons in front of Samuel, each one presumably taller, more battle-ready, more kingly-looking than the last. And Samuel, looking at the eldest, Eliab, is so impressed by his stature that he assumes this must be the one, only to be corrected immediately. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. One by one, all 7 sons pass in front of Samuel, and God rejects every single one of them. Finally, Samuel has to ask if there are any more sons at all, and Jesse, almost as an afterthought, mentions the youngest is out in the fields with the sheep, apparently not even considered worth calling in for the initial lineup, left out in the pasture while his older brothers stood for inspection. That youngest son, David, is sent for, and the moment he walks in, ruddy, with beautiful eyes and good-looking, God tells Samuel to rise and anoint him. This is the one. The pattern from Leah's household repeats almost exactly. The overlooked one, the one nobody expected to matter, the one left outside with the animals while the recognized candidates take their turn, turns out to be the one carrying the promise forward. There's a detail worth pausing on here too, because the town itself matches the pattern. Bethlehem, at this point in Israel's history, is not a significant place. A small agricultural village south of Jerusalem, not a political center, not a fortified city, barely worth naming compared to the larger towns that produced Israel's judges and early leaders. Centuries later, the prophet Micah will describe it explicitly this way: too little to be among the clans of Judah, the kind of place whose insignificance is treated as part of the point rather than a problem to be explained away. And it's in the fields around that same insignificant town, not in a palace, not in a war camp, that David is doing the actual work of a shepherd when Samuel comes looking for him, a job that in that era meant real physical danger, not a peaceful pastoral image. Later, defending himself to Saul before facing Goliath, David describes exactly what that job required of him. When a lion or a bear would come and take a lamb out of the flock, he says he went out after it, struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when the animal turned on him, he caught it by its jaw, struck it, and killed it. This is the same young man, from the same overlooked family, in the same forgettable town, who will one day be described in his own royal line's blessing as descending from a tribe symbolized by exactly that animal. Only here it's David himself, standing between a predator and a helpless lamb. A small, almost throwaway detail in his own biography that ends up mirroring the larger story this entire bloodline is quietly telling. By the time David is firmly established as king, ruling from Jerusalem with the nation finally at rest from its enemies, he looks around at his own cedar palace and feels uneasy that the Ark of the Covenant, the physical symbol of God's presence with Israel, is still housed in a tent. He tells the prophet Nathan he wants to build God a proper house, a temple worthy of what it represents. And Nathan initially tells him to go ahead, do whatever is in his heart. But that same night, God speaks to Nathan with a correction and a reversal that turns the whole plan inside out. David will not be the one to build God a house. Instead, God is going to build David a house, not a building, but a dynasty. The covenant recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 7 takes the old blessing from Jacob's deathbed and sharpens it into something far more specific and far more permanent. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. Centuries after that, when the Davidic line has been battered by foreign invasion, political humiliation, and the looming threat of exile that will eventually strip the throne away entirely, the prophet Isaiah reaches for an image that assumes the tree has already been cut all the way down to nothing. A shoot shall come forth from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. A stump is what's left after a tree has been felled, not pruned back for new growth, the way a gardener might deliberately cut a healthy plant, but felled, cut down entirely. The kind of image you reach for when a dynasty looks finished, when the royal tree that once produced David has apparently been reduced to a dead stump sitting in the ground. And Isaiah insists that new growth will come precisely out of that stump, out of Jesse's line, out of Judah's tribe. At the exact moment, every visible political and military indicator says the story should be over. The passage keeps going, describing this coming figure as one on whom the Spirit of the Lord will rest, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, of counsel and might, and painting an almost impossible vision of restored order that follows him. Wolves lying down with lambs, calves and lions grazing side by side, a small child leading them. Imagery that reads less like ordinary political propaganda and more like a description of creation itself being unwound and repaired. This raises a genuine structural problem inside the Hebrew Bible's own system, one that Jewish readers wrestled with long before Christianity ever entered the conversation. Kings are only legitimate if they come from Judah, established as far back as Jacob's blessing and cemented through David. Priests, meanwhile, are only legitimate if they come from Levi, specifically the line of Aaron, laid out in exhaustive detail throughout the book of Leviticus, down to what fabric they wear and which animals they're permitted to touch. Two separate tribes, two separate offices, and Israelite law does not allow one man to hold both roles simultaneously. The history books actually punish kings who try to cross that line. King Uzziah, generations after David, walks into the temple to burn incense himself, a priestly act, and is struck with a skin disease on the spot, in front of the priests who had tried to stop him, a very public reminder that the boundary between throne and altar was not a suggestion. So if the coming Messiah is supposed to be both a king in David's line, from Judah, and also function as a priest, mediating between God and the people the way priests were uniquely authorized to do, how does the math work when those two roles come from two completely different tribes that the law itself keeps firmly, forcibly separated? It's worth pausing on the fact that this particular king, of all the kings this bloodline ever produces, is also the one whose collected songs and prayers make up the bulk of the book of Psalms. An entire library of Israel's worship built substantially around one descendant of Judah, the tribe whose name means praise, repeatedly telling the nation to praise God through every kind of grief, guilt, war, and celebration imaginable. The thread that started with a rejected wife whispering a private confession over a newborn keeps resurfacing at every major turn of this story, and here it resurfaces again at national scale as an entire people's worship vocabulary. The Hebrew Bible actually flags its own solution to this centuries in advance, tucked inside a psalm attributed to David himself. In Psalm 110, God tells my Lord, a royal Davidic figure, "Sit at my right hand." And then, further into the poem, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, not according to the order of Aaron or Levi at all." That name should sound familiar if this isn't the first video from this channel you've watched. The ancient king-priest of Salem who blesses Abraham centuries before Levi's priesthood even existed, who appears in the text without a recorded genealogy, without a recorded birth, without a recorded death. A category of priesthood that simply predates and stands entirely outside the Aaronic system built later through Moses. Because Melchizedek's priesthood doesn't run through Levi's bloodline at all, it opens up exactly the loophole a king from Judah needs. A priesthood a descendant of Judah could legitimately hold without violating a single line of the law that keeps every other priest confined to Levi's family. There's a detail about timing here that tends to get lost, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Before the destruction of the temple, tribal and family identity in Israel wasn't a matter of oral tradition or family legend. It was bureaucratic, documented, maintained through genealogical registries the priesthood relied on to verify who could serve at the altar, who could inherit ancestral land, and who could legitimately claim descent from a given tribe. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the decades after the temple fell, describes with evident pride how carefully these priestly genealogies had been preserved over centuries, precisely because the integrity of the priesthood depended on it. Then, in the year 70, Roman legions under Titus besieged and burned Jerusalem, and the temple, along with an untold quantity of administrative and religious records housed in and around it, was destroyed in the fire. From that point forward, no one, Jewish or otherwise, has ever again been able to produce documented proof of belonging to the tribe of Judah in the way the ancient system required. No priest can prove Aaronic descent with the old rigor either, and both lines of verification effectively vanish from the historical record within a single generation. Whatever door existed for tracing a verified, documented messianic bloodline back through official tribal registries closes for good at that point. Which means the entire historical window in which a claim to Davidic, Judahite descent could actually be checked against a paper trail runs out right around the same decades. This story's central figure is already being discussed, written about, and circulated by the earliest sources describing him. An oddly narrow closing gate for a promise that had been kept alive for 1,000 years, specifically through documentation. All of which brings us to the genealogy Matthew places at the very front of his account, the one already mentioned, the one with Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and the wife of Uriah folded quietly into the family tree of the king. Matthew isn't writing a sanitized royal record. He's writing a document that says, openly, this bloodline runs through scandal, through a Canaanite madam, through a forbidden Moabite marriage, through an affair covered up by murder, through a father who slept with his own daughter-in-law without knowing it, and then nearly had her executed for it. And that, according to Matthew, is precisely the bloodline the promise runs through. Not despite the mess, through it. All of these threads, the lion, the scepter, the stump, the borrowed priesthood, the closing window of documented lineage, the scandal folded quietly into a royal genealogy, have been running in parallel for 4,000 years by this point, mostly invisible to anyone reading any single piece of the story in isolation. It's only when you step back and watch them converge on one figure, in one generation, that the pattern stops looking like scattered folklore and starts looking like a single, deliberately constructed argument, one that reaches its final, most explosive statement in the strangest, most vivid book in the entire Bible, which finally brings the story back around to that locked scroll and the weeping man from the very beginning. The book of Revelation, chapter 5. John is caught up in a vision of the throne room of heaven itself, and he sees, in the right hand of the one seated there, a scroll sealed with 7 seals, the kind of document in the ancient world that would have been rolled and sealed multiple times, so that breaking each seal in sequence was the only way to unroll it further. Meaning, the contents could not simply be skimmed or peeked at, only fully opened by someone with the authority to do so. A mighty angel calls out in a loud voice, who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals, and the search comes up completely empty. No one in heaven, no one on earth, no one under the earth is able to open the scroll or to look into it. And John, watching this unfold, begins to weep bitterly. Not a polite narrative aside, but real, visible grief. Because it seems as though whatever this scroll contains, whatever plan or judgment or resolution it holds, will simply never be revealed, sealed forever, out of reach, even to the inhabitants of heaven itself. Then one of the 24 elders around the throne leans toward him and tells him to stop weeping. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals. Every single thread this story has been tracing for 4,000 years converges, without warning, into that one sentence. The lion's cub, from Jacob's deathbed, blessing over a 4th son, nobody expected much from. The scepter that would not depart from Judah until Shiloh came. The lion image confirmed independently by a foreign prophet, paid specifically to curse Israel and unable to do it. The stump of Jesse, producing a new shoot centuries after the dynasty appeared politically and historically finished. All of it collapses into one title, announced at the exact moment despair had reached its peak. The lion has won. Whatever John expects to see when he turns to look, it is going to be enormous, and it is going to be terrifying, and it is going to look like victory the way every ancient king who ever carved a lion into his palace walls understood the word. And then John turns to actually look at what's being described, and what stands there instead is not a lion at all. It's a lamb, described as looking as though it had been slain, standing alive, but visibly carrying the marks of its own slaughter, positioned right at the center of the throne, surrounded by 4 living creatures and 24 elders who fall down in front of it. The single most aggressive title in the entire Bible, the animal every empire in the ancient world, Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Israel itself, used to symbolize conquest, dominance, and the crushing of enemies, is fulfilled not through a battle and not through a hunt, but through a sacrifice already completed. The lion wins by having already become the lamb. It is the ultimate reversal folded inside a reversal that has been running quietly through this entire family since a rejected wife stopped begging for her husband's attention and turned in sheer exhaustion toward gratitude instead. Remember what Judah's name actually means. This time I will praise. That's the word buried inside a grieving mother's exhausted surrender, 4 generations before a kingdom even existed, before a throne, before a scepter, before any of this had a shape yet. And that same root sound gets echoed at the very end of the story by an entire crowd of elders and living creatures, and eventually every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea, falling down to sing a new song to the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing. Judah means praise. And the last recorded scene tied to his bloodline, the final chapter of a story that began with a rejected wife's quiet confession, is an entire throne room doing exactly that, at full volume, forever. A rejected mother naming a child out of surrendered gratitude instead of desperate bargaining. A dying father predicting a lion where there was, at the time, no visible reason to expect one, over a son who had not yet done a single thing to earn it. A man who sold his own brother for silver, slept with his daughter-in-law without recognizing her, and nearly had her burned alive for the very sin he had just committed, becoming the ancestor of a royal line specifically because the story refuses to pretend he was ever worthy of it on his own merit. A youngest son pulled in from a sheep field almost as an afterthought, because every other, more obvious option had already failed the test. A stump, cut down to what looked like nothing, producing new growth exactly where the story should have ended for good. A priesthood borrowed from a king with no recorded genealogy at all, so that a king from the wrong tribe could still legally stand in the gap between the people and their God. A closing window of historical record, shutting for good in the very same generation, the whole promise was supposedly, finally fulfilled. And at the very end of it all, not a conquering beast tearing the seal open with claws and teeth, but a slaughtered lamb, standing, breathing, worthy. The Lion of Judah and the Lamb of God turn out to be the exact same figure, seen from two entirely different angles. And the whole 4,000-year story, every rejected wife, every disqualified brother, every overlooked shepherd boy, was quietly building, from that very first bitter name given in grief, toward one impossible word finally being sung by everyone in the room at once: praise.